Alright, once again another deck profile, this time on my Destin 1 of Exceedance Impauldio deck. Because this is one of those Destin ones I've been interested since the beginning it was introduced, which was right before the anime introduced it. And I have to say, it basically brings back Vanguard 0 because of its mechanic. Another thing is the unique design. It feels like a mix of Nova Grappler plus Messiah. In fact, the posing wise is very similar to the original Alter Ego Messiah. Another reason why I kind of got interested to it. But the playstyle really interested me a lot, playing very offensive and defensive at the same time. And it's something that I really like about this deck just because of that. But anyway, speaking of the deck itself, this deck is a 3-attack deck. So it's not a multi-attack deck, but it's 3 high-power attack deck. And it revolves around the drive checks. So drive checks for pressure, which is something I find pretty cool here. But there is one specific important order card in this deck that is basically the very key card in this whole entire deck that plays both offense and defense. In a way, you have to play around it as well, which is what I kind of find interesting because I always like to play around things. So with all that out of the way, let's just begin with the deck profile with, of course, the Ride deck. So first off, let's start off with the starter. Foul Slasher. This one you don't have to run, but it fits the theme anyway, in which we go to Impauldio. So when you ride it, reveal your grade 3 and you get this set order token. This set order token is very key. So what it does, before we continue on with the ride deck, what it does is that while it's on the order zone, you can only ride Impauldio grade 3s. So once you hit grade 3, you can only stick with the archetype. But the second skill is the main part where each time you take a damage, you put one card from the drop zone into the auto mod gauge. AKA it's just the gauge for the deck. And then if your damage check was not a trigger while you have 3 or less damage, your Vanguard gets was 5k. And by the way, this does stack. So each time you put one to the gauge, plus 5k to your Vanguard, which will increase your Vanguard's defensive value. But keep in mind, it does relate with the drop zone, so it is a weakness of the deck, especially in early game, that if you don't fill up your drop zone enough, you're not going to be able to get your gauges. And that part is very key, and this is what I mean that you have to play around with offense and defense. You have to get hit, while also at the same time, you also have to play with defense. And then the last section of its skill is that if you have 4 or more damage, you get for the 5k regardless. Although 3 or less itself, if it's not a trigger, you will still get the 5k along with it. But if it's a trigger, you don't get the 5k, but you still get your gauge. So overall, this is a pretty cool little mechanic here because it's basically as you get hit, your defenses increase. But I already said it itself, it relies on your drop zone. So in early game, it can kind of suck. So keep that one in mind. But once you're at like high damage, which is actually kind of the goal in the deck because you get stronger as more hits you get, then your defense is just kind of there regardless of trigger or not. But do still watch out for the damage check because once you're at high damage, you're not going to get any more gauges. But anyway, continue on to the grade 2, which is Impauldio. So when your grade 3 rides on top of it, put the top card of your deck as gauge and then choose a gauge card and put it to your hand. Majority of the time, you're just going to leave that as a gauge. You don't have to put a card back to your hand. The fact that you just increased by 1 gauge is actually very huge, especially by grade 3 turn. You want to hit at least 4 gauges. And also a specific amount of damage because 1 gauge per damage without heal means 5 gauges. This one means a 6, Impauldio means a 7. And that's only if you're able to get each gauges individually properly. Especially at the early game if you actually have the stuff in the drop zone. Because if you don't have the stuff in the drop zone, then it kind of sucks that you're missing 1 gauge. Because the least amount you want to hit at full power is at 8. Spoiler alert. But of course this is just for setup, so of course you must run it, in which we go to Impauldio itself. So she has 2 skills. The first one is the main one where once per turn you can counterblast 1 as an act, put a card from a drop zone as a gauge, and then look at top 5 cards of your deck to superior call grade 3 or less, and then for the rest of the turn this card gets this skill where for every 2 gauges your front row gets with 5k. So this is what I mean that it's going to be high power attack with basically just being a 3-attack deck. And she herself increases your gauge once per turn. Of course that's going to be very helpful, and she's the only one other than the grade 2 of the ride line giving you gauges each turn, so that might be a little unfortunate because you are trying to hit 8 by the time to finish off your opponent, especially for the divine skill where when your opponent's Vanguard is at least grade 3, discard 2 cards from your hand and also counterblast 1. This card gets a crit and drive plus 2. Yes, 4 drive checks in this one attack with an extra crit pressure on top of it, which is actually quite powerful on top of adding the first skill, which is going to give out even more power. Usually by the time you activate this divine skill, you'll be to 6 to 8 gauges, so that's a 15k to 20k power buff. yeah, that's going to be pretty strong itself. So already I'm liking this deck because this itself plays very offensively while the gauges play defensively, hence why I just kind of already like it. And the design wise interested me anyway. And now continuing on to the main deck. So first off, 3 more for Persona Ride because obvious Persona Ride. And then to your main rearguard of the deck, and you must see this as much as you can, it's the Winston. So Winston gets plus 5k if you have at least 2 gauges, but if you have 8, and this is what I mean, you want to hit 8 for full power, you do not lose any drive checks for its next skill. Which is, when this card attacks, while you have at least 4 gauges, you can counterblast 1 to make it perform drive checks with a drive -1. Yeah, that's actually pretty powerful, especially with a rearguard pressure drive check. So on top of Impauldio's drive checks, you get Winston's drive checks, and if you go Divine Skill and Winston at full power by then, that's 6 drive checks total, which is quite a lot, and I must admit that is actually quite powerful. It's actually what kind of makes me like the deck because mechs and strong, cool designs and powerful attacks. This is actually what makes the deck works, because without this card, it can kind of lag, and this is actually your main plus engine of the deck, basically. So you must run 4 so you can see as soon as you can. Luckily, Impauldio can Superior Call unit, but sometimes you won't see it, because I do miss this sometimes. But with a new card, there is some extra consistency to see this. So that's it for the grade 3 lineup to the grade 2 lineup. So first off, Nebula Invoke Dragon. So when this card attacks, you can Soul Blast 1 plus 5k into the end of the battle, but if you have at least 5 gauges, 15k instead. Now, the extra power buff, especially early game, is fine because this deck doesn't really use Soul so far. And I mean like really low in Soul. So that Soul Blast is actually fine in the early game as well. Just to set up your drop zone, which is actually going to be huge itself, but being a big beater on top of it is just very nice. But the second skill makes it even better because it's going to interact with some generic orders, where if you have at least 4 gauges in the Guardian Circle, it gets plus 15k shield. So this is a 20k shield on its own while also being a big beater. Yes, usually I do not really like big beaters with big shields, but this one actually helps out quite a lot for the deck, especially with the Soul Blasting, giving you more cards in the drop zone. And later on, there's a generic order that actually makes this card really good with it. So I have to say, run 4 of these. And now to some generic cards. So first off, there's Panthero Dragon. If I have a 4th copy, I will run a 4th one. Because this one is a once per turn, you can Soul Blast 1, draw a card, choose a card from your hand and discard it, and give itself plus 5k. The reason why you want to run this, despite being just a cycle of discard and draw, is that it fills up your drop zone. And that's very key. It fills up your drop zone with the discard along with the Soul Blast. And more cards in the drop zone in the early game, the better. Because in early game is usually where you struggle to get cards from the drop zone to put in your gauges. So just having ways to just put cards in the drop zone in the early game is just very helpful. But soon we're going to get a grade 1 that is called a Destroyer that looks like Frankenstein that kind of does the same thing that is on place without the extra Soul Blast costs. But it's a grade 1, so that might replace this, but that card is going to be released in set 7 and it's going to be also helpful for the deck just for the early game discard. But this card helps as well just because early game attacker as well, and besides it helps you fill up your drop zone for gauges. So you just have to run it for now because it just helps out a lot. And then next, I run the 2 generics. This one in particular helps out because it searches up a different name grade 3 to your Vanguard, aka you want to search up Winston. So that's another reason why you should technically run this. But at the same time, you don't exactly need to run this at all, but it is helpful if you need it. And then finally, to the generic order card. It's the Blitz Order Buster Barrage. So you choose 2 grade 2s with different names from the drop zone and put them to Guardian, and one of them get plus 10k. Yes, this is a defensive Blitz Order card that lets you guard with 2 cards from the drop zone, which can even be your Nebula Invoke Dragon. Which, Nebula Invoke Dragon itself would be 20k, plus this is 30k. With an additional grade 2, it's a 35k shield, and 35k shield is a lot. So yeah, this card is just very good for the deck. But at the same time, this could be a brick in your hand because you do want to see some key piece units, so you just don't want to run too many, but this is actually pretty good to run. In fact, I might bump this up to 3 just because you do have some more consistency now to Superior Call. So that's it for the grade 2 lineup. For the grade 1 lineup, so first off, the Heavy Router Dragon. It's a new card, and this is the first card that uses energy in the deck besides the Cycler, because on placed on rearguard and you have automod gauges, you can Energy Blast 3 to look at top factors deck to choose up to 1 grade 3 or less card with different name from this one to call it to rearguard, and of course shuffle your deck. And the second skill is that when this card boosts while you have at least 5 gauges, you can Soul Blast 1 to give it plus 5k. The extra Soul Blast plus 5k is just whatever, but the extra Soul Blasting right right there does help because it fills up your drop zone. But the nice part is that even though it's not exactly what the deck needs, it does help with extra consistency of superior calling a board, because you can miss a board sometimes, especially on those retire heavy decks. And it just adds some extra consistency to filter out your deck for another superior call, especially to try to get out your Winston. Because like I said, I have missed Winston sometimes, so this just increasing your chance to get it is just pretty nice. And also, this is the first card that uses energy in the deck besides the Cycler, so this is obviously going to be very good for the deck because you don't really use much energy anyway. And then another generic, Battlerin. So during your turn, when this card boosts, a grade 3, while you have at least 2 set orders, which is not going to happen, plus 5k. So just ignore the first skill. So let's get on to the second skill, where auto at the end of this card boosts, and you have a set order. You can put this as soul to look at top 5 cards to your deck for 1 grade 2 or greater card, and put it to your hand, and of course shuffle your deck. This is just here to basically add some more consistency on just adding more of your stuff, especially since most of your grade 2s or highers are basically your key pieces of the deck. So it's just here for extra consistency, and so far the deck has so much space for generic cards that there's really no other cards to run but mainly this, so I just decided to run this. There is that Persona Ride Guard Restrict card that I'm thinking about playing in, but considering that Counterblast has got a little heavy in this deck, I decided to swap it out for this because this one is actually free. So run whatever you wish in this slot actually. And then finally, the 4 Godzilla or Bulbamine, but I like to call him Godzilla because you do use a bit of counterblast in this deck, so I'd rather have the counter charge if you need it, but soul is not an issue. And then finally 4 PGs because they're PGs. And then OT, 8 crits, 3 fronts because you drive check a lot and you don't want to risk decking out, and you also have superior call engine, so it's not entirely too bad. And 4 heals, 2 being counter heals. So that's it for this deck profile on my Impauldio deck. What do you guys think of it? What other cards would you recommend and what other changes would you make? Like I said before, this deck is just fun playing both offense and defense, which is something I really like. In a way, it's kinda budget friendly since there's not too many expensive cards, unless if you're running a lot of generics. And speaking of generics, this deck has so much room to run generics right now, is kind of insane. Because, yeah, the deck is very flexible. For some reason, it doesn't have its own booster, like the other Destined ones for some reason. So that is kind of weird to me. But another very strong point about this deck is that the deck itself barely uses soul. That's another huge thing, so you have room for those soul blasting generics as well. There are so many different generics that you could run in this deck that it's kind of insane that you could actually experiment with those generics in this deck, especially since this is a 3 attack deck, all with high power. And it's something I really like, especially with the rear guard pressure and the defensive mechanic, and adding gauges on top of it to play around with is just pretty cool. Also, Messiah plus Nova Grappler, pretty cool as well. But in that, there's really not much to say about it. The set 5 support did not exactly do too much, but it did add some extra consistency, especially on superior calling some units. It is a grade 1 booster, which is something the deck did kind of lack in a way. But the deck does focus around attackers more so than anything, so it's not like the most important thing, but it did help in a way. But in set 7, we do have 2 new cards already been revealed, one of them being a Frankenstein Destroyer, which is going to of course help out with the deck because it sets up your drop zone, which is definitely going to be played in the deck, and also a new grade 2 booster, which is going to help out with more high power attacks and also does removal on your opponent. We do have a removal card for the deck, but it's only grade 1s or less, so I did not run it. But other than that, there's really not much to say about it. It's just basically a strong deck for 3 attacks with drive check pressure, and also plays defensively that you have to play around with. But on that, that's it for this, and see you all next time.